Hi, I accidentally hit the pause button. Well, we talked about Paul Roy's definition of transpersonal. So I think one of the most interesting is Glenn Hartless, who looked how the term was used in the literature, how theoreticians talked about it, how researchers talked about it. And this is what he came up with. Transpersonal psychology is an approach to psychology that studies phenomena beyond the ego as context for an integrative and holistic psychology that provides a framework for understanding and cultivating human transformation. Sometimes this is looked at as the individual transforming, sometimes this is looked at as a group or community, or maybe the global sphere, as you might see early in the New Age movement, this idea of transcending. In reviewing the literature in the classes I teach in transpersonal psychology, there's only one article that's been published on it, and I've included it in your text here. But I'm going to share kind of some of my views and thoughts about transpersonal group psychotherapy, what that means. Let me start with a couple of more texts that I think define this. So I'll start with William James, who coined the term transpersonal psychology. And I think this, to some degree, kind of captures, I would say, kind of a postmodern flavor that I think transpersonal psychology was capturing, embracing, way before postmodernism came, this kind of inevitable, subjective, limited view of reality. But William James put it like this more than 100 years ago. No philosophy can ever be anything but a summary sketch, a piece of the world in abridgment, a foreshortened bird's-eye view of a perspective of events. All follow one analogy or another. Everyone is nevertheless prone to claim this conclusion is the only logical one, and they are necessary for universal reason. They all the while at the bottom accidents of more or less a personal vision which had far better been avowed as such. So basically what James is saying here is that if we look at his ideas of functionalism, that this is limited very much from his own personal experience. You can look at psychoanalytic thought and the various schools in psychoanalytic thought, and that these are all to some degree limited subjective, that you can force this theory onto a reality. But if you look at it from a different view, and then Hartless has maybe a different view outside of ego, we can look at the ecological system. This could mean biological brain chemistry. It could mean the views of another person. It could mean the views across infinity, that things will look differently depending on perspective. You'll see this kind of stressing of broadening, widening perspective repeated over and over in transpersonal counseling ideas. So the second quote I want to talk to is probably from one of my favorite, if not my favorite, transpersonal theorists who just recently passed away, Frances Vaughan. And she said, transpersonal psychotherapy must be conceived as an open-ended endeavor to facilitate human growth and expand awareness beyond the limits implied by most traditional Western models of mental health. However, in the process of enlarging one's felt sense of identity to include transpersonal dimensions of being, the therapist may employ traditional therapeutic techniques. So I think this is the school of transpersonal psychology I fall upon, that it's as much a view as it is a series of techniques. So while Frances Vaughan stayed with transpersonal psychology up until she passed away, her husband, very famous transpersonal psychologist Roger Walsh, who I got to have some conversation with, who contributed a chapter to Shadows and Light, gave up on transpersonal counseling and psychology because he felt there was a lot of infighting, a lack of kind of focus that made things untenable for it to be seen as a force in psychology, that there were so many arms to this tree that people lost sight of what the trunk was, what the roots were. He kind of really got himself deeply embedded into the integral psychological movement, and Francis Vaughan and Roger Walsh were Ken Wilber's primary teachers. So let me say a few more things. I think transpersonal psychology has a definitional crisis, right? That even among like-minded colleagues, if you look at the book Shadows and Light, or if you look at the other, I think, classic book, the Wiley-Blackwell Handbook of Transpersonal Psychology, almost every chapter has a different part or a different view of what transpersonal psychology is. It's hard to say this is the brand of transpersonal psychology as it might be done in today's kind of marketing world, and people jump upon that and are excited about it. People get excited about mindfulness and the kind of offshoots of this, acceptance and commitment therapy, mindfulness-based relapse prevention, but transpersonal psychology has never kind of had that brand that got people excited. So I think part of the challenge of this branding or this definition is when you have such an inclusive orientation and integrative worldview, that it's hard to say what's in it and what's out of it. And sometimes I hear people say, what's transpersonal psychology? And people say, it's everything. And in some way, that's an accurate definition, as accurate as anything else. But let me try to say at least what I think it is. I think transpersonal counselors and I think transpersonal group counselors try to amalgamate a variety of psychological approaches that's been established within the last 100 years, but in addition to that, kind of have an awareness and a practical but careful integration of many spiritual practices that have developed over the millennium within various cultures and various spiritual traditions. Transpersonal counselors frequently have an interest, I think, in a broad range of disciplines. In our program, it might include meditation, Buddhism, Taoism, various yogic practice, Hindu practices. Other people are really interested in contemporary physics, anthropology, neuroscience. I think at Naropa there's a real stress and emphasis on the arts and the humanities. I think you can see this coming back into contemporary humanistic psychology. So it's a very wide integrative field that tries to kind of have cross dialogue with multiple other fields. I think something else that transpersonal psychology puts emphasis on is multiple streams or pluralistic ways of knowing. So as opposed to just phenomenological experience, which may be humanistic, existential, as you kind of see in Harteless's definition, beyond ego, which would kind of be beyond just phenomenological exploration, but it might be exploration from a bigger, wider view of what a therapy situation may look like if you're a lamp sitting in the room, or the carpet, or the impact of this on the therapist's community, or the impact of this on the client's partner in some way. So it might include qualitative analysis, from drawing of pictures to singing songs to humming to how one's connection with nature happens. Then it could also include quantitative measures of survey instrument answers to some degree. So I think also transpersonal counselors try to remain open and I would say contemporary in their thinking about therapeutic approaches. I think that's to some degree you want to stay up with common themes, findings, discoveries. It kind of reminds me of what the Dalai Lama famously said about Buddhism, which was, if science proves some aspect of Buddhism to be incorrect, what would Buddhism do? And he'd say, well, Buddhism would have to change. I think I feel the same way about transpersonal psychology, that as we discover more, transpersonal psychology at its heart is very dynamic. And so it needs to stay and be dynamic and start incorporating, say, the ideas of neuroscience, multicultural views, relational psychotherapy, to name some of the contemporary themes that are really emerging in contemporary counseling. So even within this kind of same overarching transpersonal orientation, I think each counselor will have unique areas of interest and focus. While this diversity creates challenges, it also can create a kind of interplay and continuous growth. Transpersonal counseling, I think, is understood as an unfolding process that will never be static or discrete from the changing world in which it operates. And because this lack of being rigid or static makes it very hard to operationalize, makes it very hard to define, in some way makes it very difficult to study. And the fact that it's such an emphasis on the interconnectedness, at what point do you draw the line of the behavior to be studied, or is it the thought to be studied, the feeling? Is it the impact in the environment to be studied, the impact in the community, the impact in the ecosystem? So it's very hard to know where you might draw the line. Obviously, you would draw the line in transpersonal psychology as something bigger than symptom reduction. I think personal growth would be part of it, but I think it's bigger than personal growth, actually. I think it's more community. It's my view. I think transpersonal psychology is deeply embedded in social justice views of moving beyond yourself, living your life for meaning beyond yourself, having something bigger than yourself to live for. So I think there's concerns, right? Transpersonal psychology gets associated with the New Age movement. In fact, the two aren't disconnected. But as a result, I think a common misunderstanding happens that transpersonal counseling is filled with beliefs that do not or have not attempted to be scientifically tested and rationally analyzed. For the lay public, when I say I teach in a transpersonal psychology program, people have esoteric fantasies of what I do there. I'm teaching tarot card readings. I'm doing lots of substance-induced altered state consciousness experientials, wilderness vision quests. Now, I'm not against any of these kind of practices, but I consider myself transpersonal and really do not contribute or get involved with any of these kind of things, although I have great respect for all of them. I think other people, when I say transpersonal counseling, kind of think of theoretical human developmental models. Maybe that's Maslow's classic models of various levels of transcendence, or maybe the developmental models of Ken Wilber. Academics kind of locate transpersonal counseling, I think, as a branch these days of humanistic existential traditions, and or within the framework of this kind of pastoral or spiritual counseling. I think transpersonal initially would like to see itself as kind of the superordinate category above these, but I think in reality the way it's seen in the world is as kind of a subspecialty within either this humanistic or spiritual counseling tradition. Now, transpersonal counseling, I think, is open to what's technically effective. It could be here and now explorations, it could be mindfulness-based approaches, it could be Jungian analysis filled with archetypes and mythic meanings. And then it can be really, in my view, also integrate very contemporary, empirically validated approaches, cognitive behavioral techniques, ideas of systems theories when working with families or couples or groups. And I think it depends on the client's needs, that in some way, I think treating the most pressing needs, that may be symptom reduction, ego strength, is needed before moving into kind of more non-self, non-functional realms to gain the wisdom of these other states of consciousness. And right, the classic saying is you need to have yourself before you lose yourself. So I think all these ideas are kind of part of the transpersonal tradition, and in that multiplicity, the definitional and the branding and the operational crisis and challenge was born and continues. Now, some people think transpersonal counseling solely focuses on personal growth for the worried well. I'd like to disagree. However, with an emphasis on states of consciousness, which wasn't in any definition I gave here, but I think is seen repeatedly in the literature, a focus on how do we know what we know? We have various states of consciousness, psychodynamic or neuroscience might call these ego states, and we experience ourselves, the world, and others differently depending on our states of consciousness. Which one does reality really lie in? I think transpersonal also kind of, with its roots in kind of humanist existential tradition, has a major focus continuing on life, meaning, purpose, living for something beyond it, beyond yourself. I think it has a focus on this kind of altruistic social justice view. So one of the difficulties is transpersonal psychology has a limited empirical research database. In its limited studies, I think you could summarize that it's been helpful across diagnostic spectrums. I think Cammerfer, Lukoff, for some people who've studied this. But to others, critics of transpersonal approach will sometimes discount the modality as it relies too heavily on ethereal theory, anecdotal evidence, clinical intuition. Now, this is the complaints that any kind of new school of psychotherapy that develops will have. You can see this in relational psychoanalysis can be very deeply critiqued these days. I think neuroscience, people are very skeptical of whether what we're finding is true. I would say with multiculturalism, there's people who feel that there's not enough research that to be done here to kind of deeply embrace multicultural counseling, although I think generally that has won the field over. So it's also been criticized as it's kind of too reliant and too dependent on kind of spiritual practices without an integration of these kind of empirically supported traditions. I don't feel like it has to be that way. I feel like you can give a behavioral exercise for trichotillomania, panic disorders, and that can still be transpersonal. A significant concern, I think, is this that this focus on kind of integrative, anthropological, multiple spiritual traditions, is that transpersonal counselors are kind of appropriating other cultures and other spiritual traditions without really sufficient expertise, cultural permission, and or understanding. And sometimes, I think, for commercial gain, as you can see people selling things on the internet, I think everything has a Zen before it now. There's Zen cereal, there's Zen bath salts, there's Zen jewelry. And then also, I think, to the detriment, if you understand something this much and you're giving it to your clients, there's a potential for harm, or at least a lack of progress. So I think some transpersonal therapists have spent decades of training trying to understand and drawing on the various world traditions to move their field forward. And I think I would endorse like collaboration, training, and kind of consultation, consideration in these areas. If you are very, very interested in the, say, the tradition of Sufi dancing, that I think you don't go to a Sufi dance and do this, but you study and you work with a teacher who's interested in psychology, and you kind of create a collaborative kind of cross dialogue about how that could happen. You've seen quite a bit of this, I think, in Buddhism and Buddhist psychology from people like John Kabat-Zinn, who have kind of really studied both Buddhism and Western psychotherapy to some degree. So I feel like if practiced with scholarship and supervision and ethical diligence, cross-cultural awareness, inclusivity, sensitivity, and integration with other fields and other fields of psychotherapy, transpersonal counseling can be empirically supported. It draws on many of these common factor ideas that have been shown to be very, very helpful in the humanistic tradition, or say contemporary psychodynamic traditions. I can think of the work of Jonathan Shedler in the psychodynamic tradition, or you can think of my dear friend Lewis Hoffman, who's written a lot about empirical support for humanistic and existential kind of views of psychotherapy. So I think developing these skills is a lifelong pursuit. A transpersonal therapist aims to become adept at challenging cognitive thought distortions, I think applying behavioral systems, kind of looking at object representations, but also I think part of this is developing one's own spiritual development and kind of personal development. I think we try to expand our own presence, increase our empathy, our relational skills, our accurate attunement, and kind of expand to increase acceptance, appreciation, and understanding of diverse human experiences, values, and beliefs. I think really many ways transpersonal psychology with its view is uniquely positioned to work with differences of clients' personality characteristics, culture, client preferences. Not everyone fits into a norm, and what works for the majority may not work for everyone. And I think in some way the training in transpersonal psychology may be more effective when working with people outside the norms. And I think we've seen this in kind of treatment-resistant trauma. Some of the transpersonal, whether this be substance use kind of work when people are either doing ketamine or MDMA studies, or if people are going on kind of outdoor nature vision quests, that this has been shown to be effective. So I think to some degree I think transpersonal psychology is more comfortable with having clients be outside of cultural norms and less concerned about kind of controlling negative symptoms and behaviors, and more interested in, I think, can the client have a positive life that feels positive to them, feels connected, hopefully to themselves, and potentially to something bigger and greater to themselves. So I think at its heart, transpersonal psychology is born from a desire to rebel against pathology-driven orientations. As I've said over and over throughout my talks, I think it's anti-universal nomethetical approaches. I think transpersonal psychology deeply values the unique person in their environment and looks at the person in their environment. It tries to expand Western psychological knowledge with diverse wisdom traditions. And I think its focus is on kind of this collaborative, kind of client-driven approach to therapy, as you might see in harm reduction or humanistic therapy in some way. So I think, let me say a few more things about this and try to see if I can bring this into a group idea. I think that transpersonal movement, transpersonal counseling, transpersonal group psychotherapy is really best understood as a perspective. or even maybe a spirit towards our work. As Daniel's, one of my favorite writers on transpersonal psychology, points out kind of the three vectors of transpersonal psychology. The first would be the descending vector, which might be looking at depth approaches, and might be looking at biological kind of psychoanalytic drives from either sex drive, thanatos, relational drive, drive for belonging. I think you could include this evolutionary drives to reproduce or protect your genetic kin to some degree, but a depth view of what's happening deeply under the surface, what's kind of potentially the superordinate waves that are pushing our behavior and our thinking. I think the second vector that Daniel describes is kind of the ascending vector. The first one was descending. So ascending is kind of more associated with spiritual states, connection with God, connection with the oneness of the universe, having some humility, service, kind of these aspirations that are more in the spiritual view. I think, and then Daniel says the final vector is kind of reaching out and making contact with others in the world. So I kind of expanded what Daniel said here in some of my earlier writing, and I'm thinking about this. What is the operational definition? What does this mean, this extending vector? So I thought it could mean being good in your intimate relationships. Can I be good with my partner? Can I be good as a father with my neighbors, in my society? Can I reach out to make the world a better place? Can I be active in social justice? So the successful navigation of kind of, I think, the therapeutic relationship here is you're kind of trying to help, if the client buys into it, help them navigate these kind of three pieces of exploration and meaning, digging down, reaching up, and reaching out, I might say. So I think the basic ideas here is that a transpersonal therapeutic alliance might look a lot like other kind of therapeutic alliances. There'll be empathy, they'll try to be presence, there'll be collaboration. I think maybe a little more emphasis might be put on awareness of factors beyond just a simple focus of one modality, beyond behavior in some way. So I think a misunderstanding would be that transpersonal psychology is only focused on kind of one of these three vectors. But I think, as Vaughan says, it must be balanced between physical, emotional, mental, and spiritual aspects. So, what does this look like in groups? Where do we get? How do we work with this? So I think we're looking at helping people with these three vectors to dig down, to reach up, to reach across. We're building collaboration. I think group is wonderful transpersonal practice because you get to see so many different perspectives. I feel lucky to work in Boulder, where there's so many various views about how the world works, one's place in the world. So I think if we're going to try to define the therapeutic techniques of transpersonal group psychotherapy, I think you might look at some of the classic works in transpersonal psychotherapy. So again, I go back to Frances Vaughan here, and I particularly her classic article, Transpersonal Psychotherapy, Context, Content, and Process. I think Vaughan highlights and summarizes in that article the major themes of transpersonal counseling, and these would include the openness of the therapist self-knowledge, kind of the open-ended perspective of what is possible. So beyond symptom reduction, what having a hope for clients. I can think of early in my career working with clients with severe and persistent mental illness, and in those days I would give bass lessons to clients and music lessons of various types, and then they would go on and perform in some way. And this was very much a group endeavor of having these people pay less attention to sometimes what were very destructive voices that they were chronically hearing, and listen to the other musicians in the band in some way, and kind of feel a connection often with something much bigger, as the magic of music, which is part of the universe in some ways. You can understand the universe in kind of wave forms in some way. So Vaughan also kind of emphasizes centrality of this consciousness, helping clients understand various states of consciousness, like having the people I work with being with each other and being with the music, as opposed to being with very destructive voices in their head that would say horrible things about themselves. Now, Vaughan went on to say that transpersonal psychology should not retract from other schools of thought, and it should continue to integrate new approaches. I think I've kind of covered this. Transpersonal counselors, we kind of work in service and assistance of our clients, but we make sure we're working in an ethical way from our clinical experience, have a theoretical rationale, and kind of empirical support. So if you look at these ideas of empathetic attunement, collaborative goal setting that are part of transpersonal psychology, this is validated over and over now in the Western views of Western research psychotherapy. So it also kind of values that client-led interaction, and I think it traces the kind of a client's consciousness, their kind of fluctuating patterns of thinking, affects, and behaviors. In some way, this kind of free-floating attention is similar to some psychoanalytic schools of kind of interpreting free association. But I think in some way you're kind of looking at the consciousness states and what is connecting here to meaning, Godhead, or energy beyond just maybe biological drives, as you see in psychoanalytic thought. So I think more specifically we try to follow our clients' ability to kind of notice their own consciousness, their own awareness, and their own self-reflective abilities. And I think we're working for that kind of self-mastery, so they can understand themselves. They're in charge of themselves. They're all parts of their brain, as we talked about in neuroscience, are integrated, talking to other parts of their brain. Potentially, their polyvagal system in neuroception is connecting with others, and whatever sixth senses out there, they may be connecting with that kind of sense. I think what we do as group therapists here in Transpersonal View, I think we're doing classic kind of basic counseling skills. We're empathetically tracking, we're reflecting back to clients what we're hearing, we're asking open-ended questions, we're eliciting feedback from other people, we're having those people take responsibility for their feedback. We're trying to have everyone in the group kind of initially maybe follow their own process, begin to kind of recognize their own patterns, open up to new possibilities of behaving, then open up to new ways of behaving, connecting, and being with one another. I think we hold a space to explore kind of repetitions, but eventually transcend these repetitions in some way. So I think I'll say a few things here. So some of this kind of correlates with my earlier talk about the mindful group psychotherapist, but I think this self-understanding, it has been shown that therapists who work for an increased self-understanding and who've been in therapy, who've had a contemplative practice themselves, kind of have an increased ability to kind of relate authentically. They kind of use their self for the benefit of their client. They have more choices about what skills they use, how they respond to clients. it's a more spontaneous, expanded type of therapy than, say, a manualized treatment in some way. I think similarly, the research has shown that clients with these contemplative practices are generally more attuned to the clients, read relational cues more accurately, have more empathy, and I think also has more patience, tolerance, and kind of understanding for the waves of personal growth, which comes in spurts and fits, and sometimes, and not always manualized. You don't always go from A to B to C to Z. You might go from A to G and then pop back to B and then go to L, then have a moment of Y, and then you're back at A. But having this perspective that this is how growth occurs, that for every step forward there may be some steps backwards also. So other things I think Vaughan emphasizes about transpersonal psychology, which I think group is a wonderful learning ground for, is it's important for individuals to tolerate ambiguity, right? So what's happening in a group, why is it happening, is very, very difficult to understand sometimes. It could be a repetition of two group members who are perfect fit in family dynamics, of kind of the black sheep and the golden child acting out these roles. It could be some kind of group as a whole dynamic that they're playing some kind of beyond kind of pairing dynamic that helps other people kind of not have to own their own issues in some way. So having this ambiguity that we may not ever know exactly what's happening, be okay with that, but still be able to have a life of meaning, purpose, kind of not knowing, but living meaningfully, I think is important in this endless curiosity in transpersonal psychology, to bring that to our groups, to bring that to our group members. I think that transpersonal psychology, like multiculturalism or postmodern constructivist approaches, really puts value that each person's experience is kind of relative to their particular location, history, language, culture, and current context. And in some way where this keeps us from pathologizing or putting people into boxes. So we're kind of fighting against simplicity and kind of embracing complexity here in some way. We're asking our clients how they understand a situation, and then I think we're asking them if they're open to additional perspectives, potentially from other group members, and can the other group members be open to perspectives about their perspectives from other group members. So this kind of constantly opening, unfolding, right? If everyone can stay curious, I think eventually people feel more comfortable with ambiguity, gain more confidence in themselves, gain more confidence in the world that can be a very ambiguous place in some way. So Vaughan also stressed this idea of self-responsibility. So taking responsibility for your own life. Now, this is what is possible for who you are. This doesn't mean blaming yourself for being born poor with a learning disorder or something like that, but somehow accepting your situation in life and then working with it. I think self-responsibility can be a tricky topic. It can be misunderstood. I think self-responsibility does not mean that one can just create the life they want, irrespective of the context. You can see this in some kind of self-help movement or New Age philosophers. I don't believe this. There are limits to what people can do, although potentially we might limit people more than we think we need to or have to. So I think self-responsibility can be seen as paired with oppression, discrimination, that seeing the world accurately is seeing that these things are true and are ongoing. You're not going to have someone, let's take someone, a person of color who may be obese. You're not going to have them rise above being the object of discrimination and bias in that intersectionality when they go out in the world. And but that they can, to some degree, take responsibility for how they respond, their choices, how they react to this kind of tyranny and oppression in their lives. I had a chance to work a little bit with Angel Kyoto Williams, and she kind of talked about the recognition that she had about the depth of racism against African Americans, and then kind of feeling this tremendous anger and grief and hopelessness. And this was kind of part of her path. And she found ways of thinking and kind of acting that to her felt like she had more freedom in her responses, and in this way was better able to kind of strategize of how to work effectively. So this isn't changing the world dramatically, but it's subtly what can everybody do to make the world a better place in their kind of own self-responsibility in some way. So I think transpersonal psychology will embrace techniques and exercises. I think of every world spiritual tradition, there's practices from sitting and following your breath to dancing to singing. But I think it also kind of embraces kind of this idea of there's no solid self. So the possibility for new identities, kind of neuroflexibility is very important. Other things that I think it embraces that shows positive outcomes with clients is novel experiences. So in group, you never know what's going to unfold. I think as groups move along over time, you get group members to be more spontaneous, more creative, and it can kind of be sometimes a performance art almost, and that these kind of new experiences, these novel experiences, I think expand our brains, but also expand our mind, and might even expand our spirit in some way. So let me stop here. To summarize, I'd say I think it's a view that values collaboration, client direction, goes beyond the kind of materialistic ideas of pure biology that's found, say, in the DSM. I think it's open to a wider variety of diversity of life choices, opinions. I think it's trying to engage in a kind of creative process of constantly unfolding, deconstructing, challenging things that the client believes in some way. And then very much open to having a variety of integration of various kind of other techniques depending on the needs of the clients, the desires of the client in some way. So I think this is a wonderful article that needs to be written. I haven't gotten around to it. I don't know if I will ever get around to it, but I'd love to promote any of you in the class to perhaps take this up, perhaps do your capstone project on an attempt at further defining, understanding what is transpersonal psychology, or what is transpersonal group psychotherapy. I mean, some of the earlier examples were holotropic breath work, which is kind of individual work done in groups. Some people will say sweat lodge rituals might be transpersonal group work, but I actually think they're sweat lodge rituals, and they're not really in the format of group psychotherapy, and that's kind of taking that and forcing it into a different model, a newer model. Sweat lodges have been around for a millennium, and group psychotherapy has been around for 100 years. I think we might be able to learn from sweat lodges ways that we could expand group psychotherapy but to go the other way feels like cultural appropriation to me, to kind of force that on that. So let's stop there, and we can talk about it more when we get together in class.